Hi everyone, thanks for being here tonight. It's spooky. You know me, I'm the programming librarian. My name's Erin. We are very excited to welcome Cynthia Wolf-Boynton here to do a little local history on the spooky side. It's all about Connecticut witch trials, which a lot of people think only happen in Massachusetts, but we're everywhere. Before you go, I hope you will pick up our November events calendar in the back and put it on your fridge and come join us again throughout next month. On Saturday, we also have Haunted Happenings with storyteller Marty Bishop, who is both a storyteller, a writer. She has a really great kids book out that is super cute. It's on my desk right now. And she's also a local history buff all about Fairfield County hauntings. So she knows all about like the creepy stories around here, so she spins them into tales. And it's a little bit spooky, so we say it's maybe good for kids 8 and up, but younger kids are also welcome. So we hope we'll see you on Halloween for our spooky storyteller, and that's at 1 p.m. here in the Lamb Room. Before I turn it over to Cynthia, I want to let you know that she has 2 books available for purchase in the back. They're $20 each, and this is one of them. Help me welcome her. Thank you.
Hi, I am so happy to talk with you all tonight. I'm curious before I start, how many of you were aware that there were witch trials in Connecticut? Okay, a couple, great. Well, I'm a longtime journalist. I used to be a reporter for a group of daily papers here in Connecticut. I also was a reporter for the New York Times and the Boston Globe. I've stopped traditional journalism a few years ago, and now I teach at Yale and Housatonic Community College, and I've kind of found this niche writing history books. And I think somewhere in the back of my mind, I always knew that I was going to write a book someday about witches. This is a copy of an article back from 1996 when I was a stringer for the Boston Globe, and some of you might remember that there was a bit of a scandalous case in Fairfield County. There was a school bus driver from Trumbull who was accused of casting spells on a 14-year-old boy she drove with her bus. And the two had a sexual relationship, and she ended up going to jail over that. And during the trial, it came out that she had drawn pentacles and things on the floor when the two of them were having sex, and said that it was all part of a Wiccan ritual. Well, what the Globe wanted me to do was not so much cover the trial, but to look into what is Wicca and how are Wiccans in Connecticut reacting to this trial. Now, Wicca is a earth-based religion. It's a pagan religion that's been around for thousands and thousands of years. So I ended up writing this feature story for the Boston Globe about these local Wiccans and what it means to be a Wiccan and such. And after it was published, I got this really interesting letter that came to my home. And it was in a beautiful ivory envelope, but it was thick and it was creamy and it was sealed with wax on the back. And when I opened it up, all kinds of flower petals and herbs came flying out. And it was the letter was written in calligraphy. It was unsigned, but it was thanking me for this article. And it ended with, P.S., I think you're a Wiccan too. I'm not a Wiccan, and my husband is afraid of the dark. So when I was holding this letter in our kitchen, he's like, burn that letter. You know, it's bringing spooks into the house. But I didn't burn the letter because I thought it was really fascinating. And I didn't know what I was going to do related to Wicca or witches, but I decided to throw it into my folder. Now, it's important to know that not all Wiccans practice witchcraft and not all witches are Wiccans. Despite the similarity in their names, they're two totally different things. One is an actual religion, and the other is a practice that has a lot of stereotypes associated with it. So this is really how I began with this article, put in a folder saying someday it's going to come in useful. And it turned out to be a couple of years ago when I had an opportunity to write a couple of books for the History Press. I ended up writing 2 books that were published last year. One's called Remarkable Women of Hartford, and the other is the Witch Trials book. And I went into these projects thinking that I was really writing books about women who had been who needed to be empowered in some way, that through my telling of their stories, I would bring to light either the marvelous things they did or these horrible things that were committed against them. And with the Remarkable Women of Hartford book, my ideas were true. It is a book that brings these 12 women that most people don't know anything about to life, and the accomplishments that they had that really influenced not just Hartford or Connecticut, but the nation. But the Witch Trials book turned out to be something different. Yes, it's a book where a lot of women were victimized. Misogyny ran deep in the 1600s. But one of the things that I hope comes away from the book is one of the realizations that I really had in writing it, and that's we've had witch trials for hundreds of years in America. We still have witch trials that go on now. It's just a different group of people who are being prosecuted. So maybe you'll think about that, and you'll kind of feel the same way when I'm done talking. So you can't talk about the witch trials without thinking about this idea of presentism first. And presentism is a term that historians use, and it's the idea that you can't look at the past and try to understand it with your lens today. You really have to think about, what did it mean to be alive in the 1600s in Connecticut? And I think the first word that you have to understand is that it was a very scary time. And I love this wood carving because I think it does a really good job of illustrating what kind of fears that our Puritans were facing. They came from the Essex region of England, where at the time the witch panic was at its height when they migrated and came to the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Then there was this group that came from the Massachusetts Bay Colony to the Hartford Colony. And oh my goodness, and everything about, I scared myself. I'm so fearful. Everything about life there was scary. The climate was different. As you can see, it was a very open land. There was no houses. Food was scarce. They were really building a community from scratch. Snow was something new, and there were Indians all around them. So it was a real climate of fear. And on top of it, they went to church several times a week, listening to ministers who were preaching damnation. Church was not about the glories of heaven. It was about the struggles that you had to endure on earth in order to prove yourself to be worthy of going to heaven. And one of those struggles was being able to avoid the devil and not be seduced by the devil, because to the Puritans, the devil was literally someone who walked the earth. The devil wasn't a concept, and this is a very old, 14th century tarot card. And in that image over there, those are women dancing, witches, as part of a ritual in their coven. And if you look down in the left-hand corner there, you can see the devil is ready to drag them down into hell. And that's what the Puritans believed. If a person with a gun were to run in here right now, we would all look at that person and we would be terrified. And rightly so. Well, that's how they felt about the devil. He was as real to them as a person standing here with a gun would be to us. He walked the earth, and his job was to corrupt people every day, to get new minions, and to help him in his evil mission. And there is a quote from a woman named Elizabeth Rice, who is a women's studies expert, who I quote extensively in my book, who talks about how for the Puritans, New England was really a world of wonder. And she says, it was a time where earthquakes, comets, flood, thunderstorms, and everything unexplainable was the mysterious workings of either God or the devil. It was also the devil that was going to prevent them from getting into heaven, which was their number one goal. And they took this idea of the devil and how his work was being carried out through witches so very seriously that in Connecticut, when the very first listing of capital offenses came out in 1642, you see that being a witch was number 2. This was crafted, by the way, by Roger Ludlow, who I'm assuming that you guys are fairly familiar with. But he was responsible for crafting these lists of laws. And as you can see, they all have Bible scriptures that are associated with them. And if you look at this list, murder is number 4. So, being a witch is number 2. So it's something that they took very, very seriously. And certainly a punishable offense. It was a capital crime that was punishable by death. Well, not everyone. But in writing this book, it really wasn't easy to tell this story. It really was a puzzle that had to be pieced together, because this right here is one of the better pieces of documentation from the trial. And as you can see, it's yellow, it's ripped, and it has very little information on it. I shouldn't say all, but the majority of the documentation that is left from this period in Connecticut's history is very scant. Unfortunately, in the 1600s, if they understood the importance of record keeping, they didn't go to great lengths to ensure that all of these really important documents didn't get lost or destroyed in some way. And there certainly were no things such as fireproof boxes that were able to protect them. So unfortunately, so much has been lost over the years. There are also, not that any of us know of, there are no diaries or no first-hand accounts of any of the trials, of anyone being in a courtroom, of anyone actually standing outside the gallows where someone was hanged. We do have, thankfully, a bit of testimony, but really piecing this story together was a giant puzzle. And I am very grateful for both the John Hay Library at Brown University and for the State Library and the Historical Society, because what few incomplete documents are, they have taken very good care of, and they have digitized many of them. That's actually it's lovely to look at. It's very horrible to try to read. But this is testimony from the case of Goody Clausen, Elizabeth Clausen, who was from Stamford. So those documents that do exist, none of it is a quick read. Often you have to blow it up and look at it with a magnifying glass and really be sure that you're reading it right. Sometimes I think that their whole alphabet was different than ours. So complicating telling this story is the fact that the very few pieces of writing that are out there, or that are, I should rather say, that are out there and well known, are untrue and totally fictional. Now, there have been 2 wonderful reference books that have been written over the year, one by our state historian, Walter Woodward, and another by a man named R.G. Tomlinson, that are very thick reference books with lots of facts and figures, but they don't tell a story. They don't put what happened into context or really bring the people to life. And that was one of the things that was really important to me. I didn't want to write another reference book. Those had already been written. I wanted to tell a compelling story. And so when looking at what are the compelling stories that are out there right now related to the witch trials, well, really, there's two. The most well-known one is this one. This book you might have read. It was published in 1958. It's as popular today as it was decades ago. It won Elizabeth George Spear a Newbery Award. It's set in Wethersfield, and many of its characters are people who actually lived. The problem with it is that the story is totally fictional. The relationship between the people of different religions, where they were actually located in town, where things would take place, how they took place, is all extremely fictional. So when people read this book and assume that it's historical fiction based on history, that's not true at all. And that, unfortunately, has led to many myths among those who do know something about the Connecticut witch trials. Similarly, our wonderful internet, which is both the best and worst thing in the world, doesn't do anything to stop the perpetuation of myths. So as you can see, that this is an article that ran in the 1800s in a magazine called Frank Leslie's Popular Monthly, which was a very, very popular magazine in the 1800s. And this story, and when you look at it, it looks very official, doesn't it? It was in a magazine, it was in black and white. Well, it must be real. Well, it's not. This never happened. There was never a witch from Glastonbury named Juliana Cox who ever lived, who was ever captured in the woods, who was ever then hanged later on. If you were to do a Google search when you got home tonight for Connecticut witch trials, this will be among the first things that came up. Not on the first page, but by maybe the third page, it would come up. And if you were like me, who was researching the witch trials, you would see this and you would just start cheering and being so excited because you've already read the reference books and you know that there is no reference of Juliana Cox. So for a moment you would think, ha ha, I'm a young girl who knows the internet and these old guys who wrote these other books never knew about this. So I'm gonna have something new and wonderful in my book. And that's what I thought until I called the Glastonbury Historical Society, and they told me that there was absolutely no way that as late as 1753, where by that time records were kept very well, that something like this could have happened without anybody in Glastonbury knowing. And as of this moment, nobody in Glastonbury knows about this whatsoever. So how the writer of this magazine found out, I don't know. And I actually, you know what, I thank the people in Glastonbury because they were so nice, because I called them a million times. And I kept calling different people in the office to be sure that he was sure and couldn't somebody else know, and because I wanted it so badly to be true. But it's just not, unfortunately. So what is the truth? The truth is that Connecticut has the dubious distinction of being able to say that it executed the very first person in young America for witchcraft. And that happened in 1647. It was a young woman named Alice Youngs who lived in Windsor. What we know is that she was probably found guilty of familiarity with Satan, because that was the first charge pretty much everyone who's accused of witchcraft was charged with. And we are pretty sure that she was hanged in Hartford outside Meeting House Square, which is where the old State House is now, in May 1647. Other than that, we don't know anything about her. We don't know what she did. We don't know how long the investigation went on. We don't know who turned her in to magistrates. We don't know anything, unfortunately. The other thing, though, the other things that we do know is that Connecticut had two really distinct panics One that occurred in Hartford between 1662 and 1663. It lasted about 8 months. And there was another one in Fairfield County the same year that Salem had its panics. Now, during that interim period, there were other cases. There were 34 in all, roughly, people accused that we know of. 11 of them are executed, and you can see all of the executions took place in Hartford during that very first witch panic. That doesn't mean that other people weren't found guilty along the way, because there were other people who were found guilty along the way, but thankfully for them, they did not end up being executed. And in a few minutes, I'll tell you more about why. But what's important, most important about this slide are the numbers up at the top. Yes, we had fewer people accused than the more well-known Salem, but look at the proportion of executions to accusations. If you were accused in Connecticut, there was a 1 in 3 chance that you were going to die. And that is a very serious thing to remember. The whole mindset was different here in Connecticut. And I'm just going to read you a little excerpt here. So, what could get you charged of being a witch in Connecticut? You would be charged if at least 2 neighbors said they suspected you of being a witch. If someone already convicted of witchcraft testified that you are a witch too. If after you threatened or argued with another person, that person suddenly got sick, or their cow died, or a candle led to their house burning down, or another unexplainable event occurred for no apparent reason, you would be charged. Anything unexplainable was blamed on witchcraft, Walter Woodward said. You would also be charged if a close member or a close family member or friend is suspected of being a witch, if you were born with an extra nipple or have an unusual birthmark that could be mistaken for a witch's teat, or if while being questioned you got angry or contradicted anything that you previously said. Women were also particularly at risk. In colonial New England, as it was in Europe for centuries before, most accused witches were women. They were also generally middle-aged, had a relatively low social position, and were known for being outspoken, stubborn, contentious, or frequently out of line. Married women accused of witchcraft often had relationships marred by trouble and frequently were accused by their husbands. Most Puritans also held the long-time European belief that women possessed dangerous occult and sexual powers. Widows, especially those who had inherited large estates from their husbands, were most vulnerable. Women who spoke out against the trials also immediately came under scrutiny. And this is a quote from state historian Walter Woodward. Connecticut was New England's fiercest witchcraft prosecutor. The Puritans' actions seem irrational to us now, but to them, they were being absolutely smart and rational. New England was a new, dangerous place, and life was tenuous. There were no police, hospitals, or social services. There was a government in place, but no real safety net. People put their faith in God and relied on each other. To them, religion, science, and magic were all intertwined. Satan was as real as God, and everyone believed in the power of both. So this slide shows you the colonies where witch investigations took place. As you can see, there was actually a part of Long Island where a woman named Goody Garlic was accused at the time. I know it's funny, huh? Every time I say it, I laugh. It actually was part of the Connecticut colony at the time. But closest to here, we have Stamford and Fairfield. And I thought that I would read to you a little bit about Mercy Disborough. It could be Disbauer, it could be Mercy Disbrow. Her name is spelled several different ways. This is a book that I was able, thankfully, to find a digital copy of. Someday, I'm going to walk into a tag sale or a used bookstore, and I'm going to find this actual book from 1844. It's just a slim little 98-page book, but it is a wonderful telling of Mercy's story. I don't know how much of it is actually true, but it's a great reading. But I think that illustration is just so indicative of how people saw these women at the time, or just women in general, right? She looks like a crone. She has that broom. You know, she's on this devilish-looking goat flying in the sky, and no one is safe with her around. So I'm going to read you a little bit about the Fairfield witch panic of 1692. A 17-year-old French servant named Catherine Branch sat at the heart of the Fairfield witch panic. Employed by the Westcott family and living with them near what is today the Westcott Cove section of Stamford, Catherine was said to be picking herbs when she began to feel prickling in her chest and fell to the ground, convulsing, weeping, and swallowing her tongue. In fact, in all of the witch panics, even up in Hartford, there was a lot of young girls who were convulsing and weeping. In the 21st century, those symptoms would almost immediately be diagnosed as epilepsy, but in the 17th century, they were diagnosed as the result of witchcraft. Soon, Catherine began to have visions of cats that talked to her, asking her to attend a banquet with them, promising her gifts if she followed them, and threatening to throw rats at her and kill her. 3 weeks into having intermittent episodes of these fits, Catherine began seeing the figure of a woman wearing a silk hood and blue apron standing outside the house and calling out, "A witch, a witch." Then she saw a hag-like old woman standing outside, dressed in a coat made of homespun wool with 2 firebrands on her forehead. Soon after, a local woman named Elizabeth Clausen appeared to her sitting on a spinning wheel or the back of a chair. Then Catherine saw more familiar faces. Some she could identify, some she couldn't. Although Catherine had never met Mercy Disbrower, Catherine's employers, the Westcotts, had had a disagreement with both the Disbowers and Clausen families. Fairfield neighbors at first were skeptical that witchcraft was affecting Catherine, but Daniel Westcott, a sergeant in the colonial militia, insisted that witchcraft was the cause, and that those bewitching Catherine be prosecuted. Both Elizabeth Clausen and Mercy Disbauer were brought before magistrates for questioning. Elizabeth testified that she and Daniel Westcott had argued several years earlier, but Mercy said she had never heard of anyone named Catherine Branch. To help clarify the matter, Catherine was brought into the room, and immediately, records say, she fainted. When she woke, she looked at Mercy and said, "I'm sure it is her," and began convulsing. Although no witch marks were found on Mercy, a wart was found on one of Elizabeth's arms, along with something that looked like a one-inch teat near her genitals. Both were jailed, and at Mercy's request, given the water test. Mercy was sure she would sink, but both she and Elizabeth floated like corks, even when men worked to push them under the water. Now, you can go to the spot where these water tests took place. The pond was located right near the Fairfield Museum is today, Edmonds Pond, and you can clearly see the indentation behind the museum, and there is a plaque there as well. Now, the fact that they floated like corks was a really big problem, because what would happen if you underwent the water test was that you were bound thumb to ankle, and then you were thrown in the water, and if you were not a witch, then you would sink, because the Puritans believed that the water was holy, like baptismal water. So if you sank, then God was accepting you and you were pure. But if you floated to the top, like Elizabeth and Mercy did, it meant that you were guilty and that the water was actually rejecting you. They were very lucky that the two of them lived, because many people who underwent the water test actually ended up dying. So, these two women, Elizabeth was eventually found innocent, and despite the fact that magistrates urged both her and Mercy to confess, Elizabeth said, no, I am not going to confess. And she was fortunate that she had a circle of people who knew her, who loved her, who actually were willing to stand up for her. And that kind of contradicts what I said earlier about how, you could be accused of being a witch if you spoke up for someone. But by 1692, things had changed a bit, and I'll tell you in a minute why. But thankfully for Elizabeth, this petition, which actually you can see, which is on display at the Stanford Historical Society, and it is one of the few documents that exist out there, all of her neighbors rallied, and about 72 people signed it saying that no, she could not be a witch. But Mercy did not have any kind of defender like that. There were a few people who lived near her who thought that this young woman, Catherine Branch, was actually faking it. And they would say things in her presence like, gee, we heard if you're bewitched and someone holds a hand over your head, you start laughing hysterically. And they would hold a hand over her head, and of course she would start laughing hysterically. But then, when they were all at this gathering, one of them snuck up behind her and put the hand over her head, and of course she didn't start laughing. Despite things like that happened, Mercy was found guilty, but thankfully she ended up not being executed. And really the reason she ended up not being executed, and several other people whose lives were saved, was because of this guy right here, John Winthrop Jr., at the time known as John Winthrop the Younger. And one of his allies was this guy, Gershom Bulkley, who unfortunately there are no pictures of him. Not even a sketch exists, but this is his grave in Wethersfield. But John Winthrop Jr., whose father, John Winthrop Sr., was one of the first governors of Connecticut, John Winthrop also became governor of Connecticut. But in addition to being a politician, he was also a physician, and he was an astronomer, and he was an alchemist. And very, very importantly, he believed that not everything that was unexplainable had to do with diabolical magic. I don't know, honestly, if he even truly believed in witchcraft or not. But either way, he ended up really becoming one of Connecticut's first lobbyists, because he felt that people were being killed and were actually being murdered. So he started working in what was that early version of the Connecticut legislature, along with people like Gershom Bulkley, to change legislators' mind, to get the magistrates to go along with that idea that, maybe there aren't just diabolical forces. Maybe there are things in science we don't know about yet. Also importantly, he really led efforts in the state to change the way witchcraft trials were tried. I'm going the wrong way. Back when these folks were accused and tried, one person could say that they were in a room when they saw your ghost appear in the room and put a spell that made you bewitched. And that was enough evidence to prove someone being guilty. John Winthrop said, well, you just can't take one person's word for it that a ghost appeared in the room. You need to have two people say that they were in the room and they saw that ghost appear at the same time. That was called spectral evidence. And actually, one of the reasons why the Salem trials are so well known is because Cotton Mather urged the Salem magistrates to accept spectral evidence, which led to many of the convictions, even though also at that time in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, it wasn't part of the judicial procedure any longer. So John Winthrop was a huge forward thinker. He also rallied for the very, very important change, which was that up until, I think it was around the late 1680s, if you were accused of witchcraft, you had to prove that you were innocent. It wasn't the prosecution's job to prove that you were guilty. You had to prove that you were innocent. Now, how do you prove that you're innocent of witchcraft? Especially when you can't have anyone speak up for you because they're going to be looked at as being guilty too. And the answer is you can't. So he really helped change those laws. And with those laws being changed, it led to, thankfully, people like Mercy not being executed. There were several other cases as well where women, in some cases, poor women who had married up and inherited property after their husbands died, and all of a sudden they were accused of being a witch. He helped several women and saved their lives by having their cases extended as he kept questioning. So he really was very much a hero. So I just want to go back to this timeline for 1 second. So, we had the Hartford witch panic. We had some random cases that took place in between as well. We have our Salem, we have our Fairfield witch panic that coincides with Salem. And then right between that 1692 and 1724, we have a couple from Wallingford, Winifred and Winifred Benham, mother and daughter, who were put on trial, and that was in 1697, and they ended up being the last people in the state of Connecticut who ever had to be tried. And this is not a historical document, which I'm sure you can tell, but just something pretty that hangs in the Wallingford Library. The library there is really dedicated to trying to educate people about the trials. But that last case in 1724, the last recorded charge against Sarah Spencer of Colchester, magistrates ended up rejecting the case altogether, saying that there wasn't enough as evidence. And actually, in those later years, between 1692 and 1724, there are quite a few cases where, even though charges were made against people, the magistrates dismissed the cases before they went to trial. And actually, the accusers in several cases ended up being either fined by the court or jailed for libel and slander, or in some cases before that happened, they would plead insanity, saying they didn't know what they were doing when they made that charge. And then in 1750, very mysteriously, when the new set of capital laws came out in Connecticut, witchcraft was no longer there. But unfortunately, there's no kind of documentation that tells us exactly how that happened. Who was the leader? By then, John Winthrop was out of the picture. So unfortunately, we don't know who then became the additional heroes in this movement to kind of set things right and not let fear overtake them. So this slide shows you some of the most recent efforts that have gone on to try to educate people about the Connecticut witch trials, and also to try to get some kind of formal recognition for what many people, despite the idea of presentism, believe was just terribly, terribly wrong and deserves an apology. There were two formal efforts that were made in the state, one in 2008 and one in 2012, and they were both led by the Connecticut Wiccan and Pagan Network, and they got quite a bit of support from legislators. And the first time around, in 2008, they asked for a full-fledged apology. They wanted the governor or the state of Connecticut, like other states did, to issue an apology saying that this should never have happened. Well, this bill never made it out of committee, and it never made to the legislative floor. And then in 2012, when the second round got out, Governor Malloy said that he would not consider even signing a non-binding proclamation issuing an apology, because he said that it wasn't proper for a current governor to criticize or speak about a former administration. So that kind of went away. They went to, the network also went to the judicial system and went to the Prison Board of Appeals to try to get some kind of apology issued that way, but they were told that the state does not offer posthumous pardons. So that hit a dead end as well. So then the advocates for this apology or just recognition of wrongdoing, they thought, well, you know what, we weren't officially, we weren't America yet, we were still a British colony. Let's go to the Queen and to Parliament and to ask them to send an I'm sorry note of some kind. And they never heard back. So unfortunately, this group has hit so many dead ends. They seem to be in the process now of trying to revive their efforts. There is a museum in Farmington, and it's going to, and I can't say the name, this is going to bother me. I want to say it's the Silas Webb House, but that's not exactly right. But there's a museum in Farmington that's kind of become the hub of research for what we do know about the Connecticut witch trials. And they're really trying to bring together historians who are really interested in learning more about this time. So they are silently pushing that. I am also in the process of finishing up a Connecticut witch trial trail, which is going to be an app and is going to be able to take people to the few places that you can actually go and visit today where different things related to that time took place. The unfortunate thing is, at many of these places, what you're going to do is you're going to go and you're going to look around and you're going to kind of like say, okay, I can breathe the air that Goody Nap breathed, and here is where she probably was hanged, but the area looks nothing like it looked like in the 1600s. So a little bit of imagination is required, and maybe that's a good thing I'm a writer, because I can help create some of that imagination. But really, the few places that you can go to that you can really get an idea what things might have looked like, or the Connecticut Steakhouse. And you can see there are actually gallows that are set up there in the square, though only Alice Young was hanged there. We're not 100% sure where the rest of the people were hanged. We think it's in the southern part of Hartford. And the other thing that we don't know, which is just such a terrible shame, is we don't know where any of the people who were convicted and hanged were then buried. Now, this is a grave in Milford Cemetery. This is of a man named Andrew Sanford, and he was part of the Hartford witch panic. Both he and his wife were accused and were tried, and it turned out that in this case, even though many husbands and wives, they usually were hanged together, in this case, his wife Mary was found guilty, Andrew was not found guilty, and he was banished. And he actually moved to Milford, where his brother was living, and this is his gravestone in Milford Cemetery. So we only know where actually 2 or 3 of those who were even exonerated are buried, because the stones, for the most part, have disappeared, and all the early records have disappeared. So if you go up, let's say, to the ancient burying ground in Hartford, we know that everyone pretty much from that area was buried there when they died. So there's a whole list of accused witches. We were pretty sure that they were, because they were exonerated and still considered worthy of being buried in a cemetery, that they had to go into this area. But there are no records going back from that time. And in parts of Hartford where they think the cemetery extended to, there are huge skyscrapers now. So, we can't go digging under there. There is a beautiful part of the ancient cemetery that a lot of people have worked very hard to maintain and to somehow document these early lives with bricks and other things. But to me, it's such a shame that you can't actually, walk the walk or see any of these places and be able to go back to that time, because it is such an important part of our history. Can I answer any questions for you? Yes.
I have read a while back that water test was especially hard for women postmenopausal because of their body density. And that actually, I forget where I read it in a feminist article about how women, particularly older women, were at risk because that water test, there was some, I don't remember the physics of it.
Sure.
Due to their density in their bone.
Isn't that interesting? I've never heard of that.
But as you were talking about it, I remember hearing that, thinking, what was it about them? But there was some definite prejudice towards older women.
Oh, definitely. But that makes so much sense, right? Your bones are thinner. They might be, who knows, they might be more buoyant,
It
and,
was something to do with that water.
you're a little chubbier, and there's a lot of reasons why you could float. That's fascinating. I don't know, but I'm going to, because I like that. Could you sink and survive? If you didn't drown. Oh, yeah. Well, you know what? In Edmonds Pond, thankfully, it's very shallow. So, yeah, you could have gotten out of there. But there are lots of people who, died, not in Connecticut that we know about, but in other states. I mean, there were witch trials everywhere. New Hampshire had them, Virginia had them, the Carolinas had them, Boston, New Hampshire. I mean, they were everywhere. We only know about Salem's, and I think it's because, everything there was helter-skelter. It was chaos. It was chaos. They didn't follow the law. Whereas in Connecticut, I think part of the reason why so few people know about it is because, as harsh as it sounds, it was business as usual. We were very meticulous in Connecticut. We followed all the procedures. So there was no reason for it really to stand out. In fact, I have quoted somewhere in the beginning of my book, Jonathan Trumbull, and when he was at Yale, he wrote the introduction to a history book. And he is quoted saying in this introduction how wonderful Connecticut never had any witch trials. And that was in the 1800s that he wrote that. And it's just amazing. It's amazing what people don't know or don't see for whatever reason. Yes?
When did we get all the religious things out of the laws of the state of Connecticut? I mean, we haven't completely.
I was going to say, have you watched the Republican debates? I don't know. I see a lot of religion. I don't know. I truly don't know. I am not that much into the.
So can we still sink witches and stuff like that?
No, we can't do that anymore. No, we stopped witchcraft in 1750. When is it? 1750. It's when witchcraft stopped being a crime. So it went off as a capital offense and didn't even go on as a non-capital offense.
What did the religious leaders do at that time then? They must have been up in arms that would be taken as.
I'm sure they found someone else to prosecute. Truly. Yes.
Was this just a North American sort of frontier colonizing phenomena, or was this happening in Europe and in England
Yes.
as well?
So our Puritans brought it from England. But if you look at the history of witchcraft, this kind of hunting witches goes back to ancient times. They did it in Rome and Greece. They did it throughout Europe. And actually, by the time that there was this huge Puritan migration, I believe it was in 1633, and the majority of those Puritans came to the New World from Essex, this Essex region. Most of England had kind of calmed down about witchcraft by then. It was all really focused in that area of Essex, and so they did bring it over with them to the New World. But yes, it was throughout Europe. And, what can I say that's good about our Puritans? We didn't burn them. We hanged them. In Europe, they would burn them. Aaron, are you looking at me because of time? Are we okay? Okay. Oh, oh, okay, great. Okay, good, because I don't have my glasses on and I can't see the clock, so I have no idea what time it is. Any other questions? Yes.
Did the magistrates, were they just geographically located, or was it like a roving band?
You know what, that's a really great question, and I'm just gonna go back to my little map, because one of the things that I'm currently looking into now is that, so there were magistrates from each colony in Connecticut. They were each allowed to have, 2 or 3 of them. And when there was a capital case, they would have to go to Hartford. All the capital cases were tried there. There were a few exceptions during the Fairfield witch panic, because there were a couple of, actually there was about 5 women that were all accused as part of that. The trial moved to them. But no, you were tried in Hartford. And that's where the general court met, and they covered all large crimes. And now, what's been said in the traditional research that's been done about the witch trials was that the general court met at the Meeting House in Meeting House Square, which is where the old State House is right now. But I am starting to think that might not necessarily be true, because I found on archive.org this very, very old book that's been digitized about the history of Hartford. It was written in like the 1700s, the early 1800s, very dry book. But it's everything from, they set up a house here, and then they build a house there, and then they built another house there. It's kind of like how the government and the Hartford colony was set up. And there is just these couple of lines in passing almost that talk about how, because the magistrates came from different places, that they would hold their capital trials in an inn. So if they held capital trials in an inn and magistrates would come all over for them, wouldn't they hold the witchcraft trials in an inn too, and not the Meeting House? So, that's a current mystery that has my interest. But yes, they came from everywhere. So there wasn't just a group that was responsible. In each colony, the magistrates would decide whether there was enough evidence for you to be indicted and then sent to Hartford. But, once you were indicted locally, then it was the colony-wide, the large colony-wide group that made the major decisions if you're going to live or die. Did I answer your question?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Thank you.
Were the magistrates secular, or were they part of the church?
Oh, everybody was part of the church. If you were secular, you wouldn't be a magistrate, because there was no separation whatsoever between church and state. It was all the same. In fact, one of the most brutal prosecutors, or interrogators rather, in Connecticut was a man named Samuel Stone, and he was a minister in Hartford, and he just decided that it was his mission in life to get people who were accused of witchcraft to confess. And there was a manual, actually. It was called The Discovery of Witches. Not as fun as Deborah Harkness's trilogy of books, if you happen to have read them. But it was written by a man named Matthew Hopkins, who was the Witchfinder General in England. And you can actually download it on Project Gutenberg online. And it is an instruction manual on first how to find a witch, and then once you get that witch, how to get them to confess. And again, along those lines of interrogation, I'm happy to say that, Connecticut didn't use the knuckle crunchers or anything like that. The most common thing we did was a process that Hopkins recommended called watching and waiting. And with watching and waiting, it's just like it sounds. You would put the accused in a room, and they didn't have traditional jails then. It was just a room and a house. But you didn't have any bedding or anything unless your family brought it to you. So most of the time, these people would just be in a room with nothing, and they wouldn't be given food, and they wouldn't be allowed to leave to go to the bathroom. They had no chairs, no nothing. And the idea was that the interrogators would watch, and they would wait. And they basically would wait for you to break. And they would go in, and they would question you, question you, question you. At nighttime, when you started to fall asleep, they would knock on the door, and they would rattle cans so you could never sleep. So there was a lot of psychological torture that went on, even though it wasn't physical torture. Yes?
What did the Crown in England have to do? I mean, we had a governor at the time established by the Crown. They just said, okay, they want to be crazy, that's their business.
So actually, when, that long period in history where we have this lull right here with witchcraft trials, that was actually when John Winthrop Jr. was over in, no, I'm sorry, I'm lying 100%. In 1662, when that everything was going on in Hartford, that year, John Winthrop Jr. was over in England. He was getting the royal charter that would give the Connecticut colony autonomy. So, no, I mean, we were autonomous to govern ourselves. We had to pay taxes to the royal, I think it was, King Charles at the time. But no, we did our own thing. They didn't care. We just had to pay our taxes, basically.
We have time for one more question.
Yes.
In your research, have you come across how prevalent or how many members of the Wiccan community there are today in Connecticut?
I couldn't give you a number. I truly couldn't give you a number, but I think it's a safe comment to say more than you think. I think that there are I know that there are quite a few active covens in Connecticut. I think that there are such misunderstandings about their religion that most people who are pagans don't talk about it because the average person can't make that differentiation between being a Wiccan and being a witch. And as part of the pagan religion, just like in the Catholic Church, you might use incense, right? You drink wine, you have the wafer. They have different rituals. They have rituals that involve herbs and flowers and, dancing with their hands up, by the sun.
Can I ask a question? I just realized we only have time for one more issue.
Oh,
But I used to do Morris dancing, English Morris dancing, for many years. And I taught in different parts of the country. And I taught in Gwinnett County, near Stone Mountain, which has a certain history. And I remember in the 80s that the superintendent sent out a thing that we had no pagans, that everybody was no humanists, no pagans, whatever. And at that time I was dancing, Morris dancing. I danced it in several states. And many of the people I danced with, they burnt only in winter. We had herbs. I won't get into the whole thing. And I certainly know people who are Wiccans in different places.
mm-hmm.
And I think that there's a lot of bias towards anybody who even talks about it. I mean, I was into the Morris dancing. But I too was like, well, what's going on? This is all
Right.
ritual. I guess what I'm saying is I think that it's still that kind of thing that people don't talk about.
You're 100% right.
In Gwinnett County in the 80s, it was like I was afraid to lose my job if they found out I did anything like that at all.
Yep.
I really didn't talk about it.
You're 100% right.
Mentioning what the Morris dancing, the whole thing comes from an ancient fertility rite dancing.
And it's the same kind of thing. And so people really,
Just look at me like, what?
so Wiccans today, usually they keep to themselves. They have a very active network, but they are all over the state. But when you hear words like coven, you immediately think, Margaret Hamilton and Big Black Hat. So it's hard,
It's a taboo.
It is very taboo. Well, thank you. You were lovely. You're a lovely group. Thank you so much. If you're interested in a book, I'm happy to sign it for you. And thanks so much for coming.